Bien.
Welcome, bienvenidos. It's 11 o'clock here in Champaign, Illinois. My name is Gloriana Gonzalez. I'll be the moderator for this wonderful speaker who's coming here today as part of the Dean's Distinguished Speakers Series. The title of the series is Addressing Systemic Racism Through Justice and Equity, the Role of Faculty at a Community Engaged Empowered University. And our guest today is Dr. Patricia Perez, and this event has been co-sponsored by La Casa Cultural Latina, and we are very happy to be with you today. Before we start, we want to make sure that we take the time to do a land acknowledgement. And please make sure that wherever you're at, you do the same. The lands that are now called Illinois are the ancestral homelands of many tribal nations, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutins, Sauk and Fox, Meskwaki, Hikapu, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Chickasaw nations. Today, Native people from over 100 tribal nations continue to call these lands home. We begin our presentation by acknowledging the histories of dispossession and erasure that these tribal nations and their citizens have faced. With tribal sovereignty at the core, we actively work to center the voices and lived experiences of Native peoples through addressing contemporary effects of colonization and systemic racism. And Dr. Patricia Perez, mi amiga, I'm just so happy, is a professor in the Department of Chicanx Studies and inaugural coordinator of the HNS Collective for Justice, Equity, and Transformation at California State University, Fullerton. Dr. Perez conducts research on U.S. higher education inequities with an emphasis on students and faculty of color. Her recent publications include the wonderful book, The Tenure Track Process for Chicana and Latina Faculty, Experiences of Resisting and Persisting in the Academy. Also facilitating educational success for migrant farm worker students in the US, and higher education access and choice for Latino students, critical findings and theoretical perspectives. Dr. Perez is recipient of several awards, including recognition for exceptional teaching, service, scholarship, and honors for outstanding mentorship. Dr. Perez is a board member of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. Dr. Perez received a master's and PhD from UCLA and also holds a master's from Harvard University and an undergraduate degree from UCLA. Born and raised in Santa Paula, California, Dr. Perez is a first-generation college student with family roots in Southern Arizona, Guanajuato, and Sonora, Mexico. Dr. Perez is the proud mama of 3 children. And we were fellows at the New Leadership Academy, and we shared a lot of experiences together, but I am just so happy to have here someone that I admire so much And there you go. Let's get started, Dr. Perez. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intro. Buenos dias, good morning. As Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, I'm Patricia Perez, pronouns she, her, ella. I'm joining you all from the home and the traditional lands belonging to the Tongan nation who are still caretakers of this land. I want to say just really quickly, thank you to the College of Education. Thank you to Jim Anderson, Dr. Rodney Hobson, Doctora Gonzalez, La Casa Cultural Latina for their co-sponsorship. And thanks to all who have joined us in the Zoom room. This is exciting. This is a good turnout. Thank you all for being here. As part of this talk, I've been asked to share some themes from the edited book that Dr. Gonzalez mentioned. So the title of this presentation is Chicana Latina Warriors Surviving in the Academy Together. And I hope to connect themes to your distinguished speaker series theme, addressing systemic racism through justice and equity, the role of faculty at a community engaged, empowered university, specifically as it relates to the community engaged scholar and university. Just to give you a sense of the plan for the talk today, I will start a little bit about sharing about my background, because that directly informs the issues that I look at and how I look at them and why. I'll provide a little bit of context for the Chicanas and Latinas in general, and then provide a more specific context for Chicanas and Latinas in the academy. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face as both women and then as women of color, and then talk about some recommendations connected to those challenges. I'll leave you all with a few resources, and then finally we'll engage in some dialogue at the end. So first, as Dr. Gonzalez mentioned, I'm a first-gen student. I come from this small agricultural town. That's that picture on the left. Very idyllic, surrounded by orchards and orchards, lemons and avocados and oranges. And my family ended up there because my grandfather was a bracero, and he picked lemons in those very fields for 30 years before he retired. And so I have this soft spot in my heart for students from migrant communities, students from migrant farm worker backgrounds. But coming out of this agricultural town and then, meeting the correct, the right people, the right mentors, the right folks that would provide me with college knowledge to get me to UCLA as an undergrad. When I arrived, I wasn't prepared for that culture shock. And I started asking a lot of questions, where are the other folks that look like me? How come I, was one of the only ones that made it to a four-year university? And that would really set me on this research agenda that underscored equity, access, for both students and both faculty of color. And so, I was very lucky to land a tenure track job immediately after finishing my PhD. And that experience was, in an ethnic studies unit at Cal State Fullerton. There was a huge learning curve there, again, as first-gen faculty, as first-gen student. And you may think, well, how much of a struggle could it be? You're an ethnic student, ethnic studies, you're in an oasis of faculty of color. Well, there were certainly lots of faculty of color around, but I was joining a department with 5 other men, and I was the only woman. And so there were definitely values that we shared, but there were spaces where, we just weren't on the same page. And so, I survived, as a matter of fact, I'm more than survived. I was the first woman to be tenured in my department since its founding in 1969, 1970. The colleagues pictured here, that's Dr. Monica Hanna on my right. She is number 2, the second woman to be tenured in my department. And then Gabriela Nunez, Doctora Nunez on the left, she was the third. And so again, thinking about those experiences coupled with, this first gen trajectory as an undergrad, I really wanted to, share those experiences and center those voices for other Chicano and Latina faculty so they wouldn't find themselves in the same boat. And so I took inspiration from these two texts, Carrie Ann Rockmore and Tracy Laslofley's The Black Academic Guides to Winning Tenure Without Losing Your Soul, as well as Presumed Incompetent, Intersections of Race and Class for Women in Academia, edited by Gabriela Gutierrez Imuz, Yolanda Flores Niemann, Carmen Gonzalez, and Angela Harris. I appreciated these texts so much because they centered women of color voices, and again, really motivated me to do the same for Chicana and Latina voices. So I want to honor, these are all the women that contributed to the tenure track process text. There are 9 chapters across the volume, and really these women all made it possible. They represent various regions, various leadership positions, from associate professor to former presidents, former deans. I want to say all earned tenure and were granted tenure. I think I will say that one of the major limitations of the text is it does not represent the Chicano and Latina faculty who may have earned tenure, but were not granted tenure. I think that's a different conversation, and I don't see those things as the same. So I mentioned I wanted to provide the current context for Chicanas and Latinas, just overall. This is some data coming out of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. Mostly stats related to California. I've heard there's some California transplants in the Zoom room. But I wanted to bring your attention to this for very important reasons. So the text came out, the hardback came out in 2019, paperback came out in 2020. So obviously it was pre-COVID. I think that, pre-COVID has just sort of lifted the veil and just exposed inequities to a heightened degree. But I will say here that communities of color have been hit hard by COVID. The Latinx community has been hit hard by COVID. I mean, that's just an understatement. I just pulled some quick data from the COVID tracking project. In Illinois, for example, the Latinx community accounts for 17% of the population, but 25% of cases and 16% of deaths. In California, the Latinx population is 39% of the state, but they represent 55% of cases, and unfortunately for 46% of deaths. And so, the Latinas and the Chicanas that were hard hit, especially those, for example, if you look at the stat, nearly 30% of Latinas and nearly 40% of undocumented Latinas lost their jobs in the first few months of the pandemic. We're talking about our in some ways we're protected, maybe not our lecturers so much, but we're protected in higher ed, things connected to our education. But these are, our mothers, our sisters, our family members, our students, their mothers. And so it's added this layer of complexity to higher ed that's filtered into so many spaces, and again, just revealed so many more inequities that folks were really thinking about. So within the US Academy, Chicanas and Latinas have a very represent a small proportion. So when you look at full-time faculty and degree granting institutions by race, ethnicity, sex, and academic rank, this data came out in 2020, but it's based on fall 2018. I think it's really interesting. So overall, Hispanic females, and that's the term that NCS uses, Hispanic females and males account for 30% of this larger group. And when we say degree granting, we're talking about everything from community colleges through, to 4-year. And if you look at the different systems, there are higher proportions of faculty of color in the community colleges relative, to the 4 years. And similarly, similar to Hispanic males and Hispanic females, Black males also represent 3%, as well as their female counterparts. Um, Asian and Pacific Islander males are 7%, Asian Pacific Islander females are 5%. If you look at American Indian or Alaskan Native folks, or folks who mark 2 or more races, they are 1% or less. White females represent 35%, and then white males represent 40%. You'll notice, this arrow on the left here, as Hispanic female professors go through the ranks, or I should say not, though, those numbers decline. And so you'll end up at the end with 1% of less, 1% or less, depending on the data that you're looking at the full professor rank. In the table on the right, you will see that the NCE's data that Hispanic males are concentrated at the lecturer instructor rank. It's also the same for their male counterparts, but if you look at sort of the distribution across the ranks, for Hispanic males, they're a little bit more evenly distributed, even though if you look at the total, they're only off by 150, the Hispanic female versus Hispanic male. So, I always think about when I get those comments, well, you don't look like a professor. Well, that's because statistically, the likelihood of you having me as a professor is not as common as you having a white professor or a white male professor. And so now when I get those comments, I just kind of laugh it off because I, after having looked at the data, I get it. There you go. Okay, so let's talk about challenges for women in general. So, challenges and what's contributing to sort of these declining, as women go through the ranks, numbers decline both for, for all women and especially for women of color. So for women in academia, they're often viewed as less competent. They're rated lower on teaching evaluations, and unfortunately, they're cited less often. Women have lower salaries than men. And women in general, if you look at the research, they have more service commitments and they spend more hours doing whether that's advising or mentoring. And unfortunately, that also translates into the home and to caregiving responsibilities. And so you'll find that, COVID has exacerbated those responsibilities. But women will end up spending more time doing housework. There, just to share a quick stat, according to data from American Time Use Survey, women spend about 113 minutes on housework daily, and that's relative to 43 minutes for men. So I want to talk specifically about some of the challenges that Chicana and Latina face, generally speaking here. I think one of the largest challenge is connected to these gendered and ethnic stereotypes of what Chicanas and Latinas should be, and they manifest in the teaching evaluations. So when they don't fall into the gender ethnic stereotype of being, these very feminine and kind and nurturing, motherly, or maybe even docile and compliant, then they're blasted in the teaching evaluations. In one of the chapters in the text written by Patricia Arredondo, she interviews several different deans and presidents, all Chicanas Latinas. And in her research, she shares that these women received, in these challenges to their scholarship. They challenged their way of being. They received direct challenges to their authority, and their accomplishments were often minimized. And so her research really highlights that it's not limited to, these challenges are not limited to faculty, but they're also happening to administrators. I showed you the numbers earlier in terms of, assistant, associate, full professors, folks that are Chicanas and Latinas, it's no wonder that there's a lack of role models. There's just few models and leadership positions available um, to look up to. The availability of mentors or femtors poses one of the most significant challenges. Again, simply not enough tenured Chicana Latina faculty to provide mentorship. And that's not to say that non-Chicanas can't mentor Chicanas. We need that type of mentorship also. But one of the important, I think, running themes throughout the text was that that mentorship needs to be culturally relevant mentorship. Another challenge is this, with both the cultural taxation and the gender taxation, this invisible labor where, Chicana, Latina faculty and other women of color are carrying larger service burdens that's not compensated. It's often emotionally taxing. And obviously it takes precious time away from their research and their teaching, or honing their teaching. Another challenge is, and this is something shared by Carolyn Turner, who contributes the foreword to the text. There are fewer opportunities for professional socialization for Chicana Latina faculty. They have fewer opportunities to participate in apprenticeships like research and teaching assistantships, co-authoring papers with faculty members, making presentations at professional conferences, and being introduced to the faculty network of influential academics who could provide support or future opportunities down the road, or may end up writing those external letters for review for your tenure files down the line. And finally, they are less likely to participate in student and faculty initiated mentoring opportunities. So what are some recommendations based on, some of these challenges? I think we really need to revisit our mentoring programs, the way that we approach mentoring. We have this, I think, antiquated model where you're a junior faculty with the senior faculty, and the junior faculty is sort of, just receives all this information, takes it all in. And it's the responsibility of the senior member to just, do that. I think we need to move away from that model. I think it should be a reciprocal relationship. It should be mutual, ideally centered Chicana Latina identities, or whatever other social identities are important to the faculty members. It shouldn't be this hierarchical relationship. It should be intergenerational. It should be like a mentoring support circle. We should give folks opportunities to build trust and confianza in this space. And ideally, the leadership development should be part of this mentoring project. I've listened to so many panels, women of color leaders, and attended so many workshops. And, one common theme I always hear is, oh, I just happened to be, in the right room at the right time. And I hear that too often. And I think, why does it have to be accidental that you landed in this leadership position because you happen to be in the right space at the right time and somebody happened to retire, or, I've even heard, somebody passed away unexpectedly. Again, all these, weird things that had to converge so that that woman, would end up in a leadership position. I think the second recommendation is related to this scholarship alignment. The scholarship that we need to the work that we do is aligned with transformational work. And when I say we, I'm talking about, women of color and faculty of color, in general. We're engaged in this community engaged scholarship. We do it because it's transformative. We don't do it just for sake of research. And we're recruited because we're doing these innovative things and we're hired for these innovative research methods, whether it's participatory action research or again, this community engaged scholarship. We do this work because it's important to us and it aligns with our values. But then when it comes time for review, it's not valued in the same way or it's deemed not rigorous enough. And so the question becomes, do you really want us to bring our authentic selves? And if so, then show me with the positive tenure review. If not, then that should have been very clear from the faculty position description, what it is that you're really looking for. And we shouldn't throw around these words like justice and inclusion if we don't, in fact, mean it. And then the final recommendation that I will share here, I think it's important that we provide professional development for specific resources. And so, I'm thinking about campuses on where there are very few Chicana Latina faculty, help institutions should help those folks find spaces where they do exist. So, until that university has a critical mass of Chicana Latina faculty or women of color, institutions should share professional development funds with faculty to attend conferences where those women of color are present. So, for example, the Faculty Women of Color Conference it's called the Faculty Women of Color in the Academy National Conference out of Virginia Tech. Another example, the Women of Color STEM Conference. There's Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. For faculty of color, I'm thinking about of course, American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, because I'm a board member, but there's also the American Association of Hispanics, American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed. There's the National Latinx Psychological Association, right? On and on and on. I think you get the point. So the bigger point, institutions should provide funds for folks to be able to attend those conferences where, they're just spaces where folks are reinvigorated, they're re-energized, and then they come back to do continue to do the great work that they are at their institutions. The other point related to professional development funds, and it connects back to my first recommendation, is to provide a pool of monies where folks can self-organize and create their own mentoring support systems, and build their own communities and provide. And it doesn't have to be a lot of money, but provide money for snacks and meals and coffee, and provide small, maybe pilot funds to engage in potential community engagement projects. So I mentioned I wanted to share a few resources. These are just, some, if you want to look at some of these issues a little further. I cited some of the work by Cardell et al. In the presentation. I really appreciate that article because it isn't just about, here are some, here's the lit, this is where it stands, but they have concrete examples and they provide links to all those examples from across the US. So I definitely recommend checking that article out. Anything by Leslie Gonzalez and Kim Griffin is just amazing. So I would highly recommend their work, especially as it relates to supporting faculty of color. And then finally, I'd like to leave folks with different types of resources. This is a podcast hosted by a colleague, Dr. Michelle Espino Lira, called Latinx Inteligencia. But according to the podcast, the purpose is to cultivate the uplift for the Latinx community in higher education. It's in season 4 now, so there's quite a few episodes that folks can check out. But themes really center around like scholar activism, mentoring, the writing process, and writing books. They also talk about in the podcast anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. But and it's really interesting because she brings these intersection, these folks that don't always talk to each other, but she talks with students, she talks with faculty, she talks with administrators and community activists. And so I highly recommend that particular resource. So I went over a little bit. I was asked to talk about 20 minutes, and so I apologize, but this is my contact information. I wanted to share that with you in case folks wanted to reach out to me, but I think we're going to engage in a dialogue now.
Thank you so much. I read the book and I made like 3 pages of questions, and then we went back and forth about the questions in this session, but we're also welcoming questions from all of you. So to get us started, you talk about scholarship alignment, and I was very moved by a case in the book of a professor who turned the fight for her child's autism into scholarship. And I think we can find similar examples of women of color whose work is deeply personal. So how do we validate the scholarly work that involves activism, that is much more than writing papers?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I love that narrative, and you're talking about Dr. Elena Peña, who's at Cal Lutheran. And just to provide some context, she talks about her experience when her toddler, I think he was about 18 months, she started to notice things weren't developing as they should, and she found out that he was autistic. And so she went to her university and was going to leave academia because she didn't quite see how that was going to work with, trying to support her son the best the way that she could. And I think what was amazing about that was her university said, no, we're not going to let you go. We're going to work with you. We're going to give you a reduced appointment, but we're going to keep you on, the tenure clock, but we're going to give you an extension if you need it. And essentially they worked with her. I think the other accommodation related to that was she had been hired to look at access for students of color, access for primarily Latinx and Black students. And she decided she was going to change her research trajectory. And they were okay with that. And that's not always the case. Like, you're hired to do one thing. And then when you sort of pivot and you have to explain, well, how does this connect to what you originally were hired to do? It didn't pivot a whole lot. So now she is dedicated to looking at students of color with autism, still connected to higher ed access. But what's amazing about her story, I mean, there's so many things that are amazing about that story, but she is now running a center. She fundraises with the university, and she's bringing all these funds to look at, communication for autistic students. And so she's the director of this Autism and Communication Center at Cal Lutheran now. And I'm sorry, I got so wrapped up in sharing that example that I forgot your question.
So the question is how to validate work that it's scholarly work that involves activism. I think we are in this pressure that we need to produce papers. People are counting their vidas and trying to figure out what's the right number. But how about work that involves activism that comes from the heart, also comes from connections with communities?
Well, I think this is where I was speaking to, are you going to really hire us to do that type of work? And if we're not seeing the positive reviews, then in the tenure review along the process, then your actions are not telling me that that's the case. And so, one, we need to be very transparent about if that in fact is truly valued, right? And then I think they need to be integrated in our standards so that it can be captured. In many ways, we have to sort of stretch the language and manipulate and talk about, conform what we're doing to these university standards, right? It should be the other way around. I shouldn't have to work that hard to justify why I'm engaged in this particular project, right? We have these impact factors for journals, right? we should have something similar for the impacts that we're making in the community, right? The impacts that we're doing, the impacts that we're making with the students of color that we work with, or maybe the faculty that we mentor. There's not always a space in the formal standards, but we need to institutionalize that and formalize that. And so that's working with your academic senate, right? Working with your DEI committees on campus to make that happen. Because until it's institutionalized or formalized in some way, we're never going to get the credit that it deserves. And it's a lot of work. I mean, it's not easy to launch those projects, to continue those projects, to start them. They're very time consuming, but we do it because it's valuable and meaningful.
Thank you for that. Um, so you said a little bit in your talk that we're not what professors look like. And that is a theme that keeps coming back in the book. Um, can you speak about that issue for women of color in terms of teaching evaluations?
Yeah, so we're talking a lot about this in at our university. They've put together this whole almost half a page of text to accompany the evaluations, the student evaluations, talking about how they're biased towards particular groups, right? How it's not a true measure of, teaching effectiveness or performance, right? Or however you want to couch it. But then on page 2 is the evaluation. So we're still going to use it. So, there are other ways to measure teaching effectiveness, how good you are as an instructor. And, you know, I would love to just get rid of student opinion questionnaires, student evaluations. It's just not, but well, I will say this, if you're going to use them, you should also ask the question, what grade do you expect to get in this course? Because there's a strong correlation between positive evaluations and good grades, right? And then folks that didn't do as well as they'd liked and bad evaluations. So I will say that.
So the 3 components usually in tenure are research, teaching, service. And another theme is the book is this notion of cultural taxation, that we can add different types of taxation that people who are, who may get in different positions because they are representing or meant to be representing the voice of one particular group, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that taxation could mean for women of color who are asked to do more service? And so speaking to leaders who are considering these issues in compositions of committees or in reviewing a tenure packet, things like that.
I don't know if folks recognize, that women of color just often tapped more, and for different reasons, right? You want diverse voices at the table, and so women of color, they check 2 boxes, and so they may be called on more. The other thing to keep in mind is the demographics of our institutions are changing. More students of color are going to post-secondary education. And so, I know at a state institution like mine, the largest proportion of our population is Latina students. And we know, based on the lit that they're more likely to gravitate towards, Latina faculty, women of color, just because they feel more comfortable. And so as demographics of our the students continue to change, they're going to keep gravitating towards people that look like them. And so that's something else to keep in mind as you think about these, these service loads or these mentoring loads. And I don't think that everybody is aware of that. Um, also because of, what we look like and who we are. For example, leading up to Hispanic Heritage Month, my email inbox gets fuller, right? Um, Leading up to next month, the Cinco de Mayo, my inbox gets fuller, like simply because, and so those, I think about those requests, and it's not really about me, it's about what I represent. And so we need to think about, okay, when I'm approaching as a leader, when I'm approaching this faculty of color to engage in this project, I want it to be about that person. I don't want it to be about what that person represents, because no one sole person can represent the larger group, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope that tries to get at it.
It does, and thank you for giving specific ways of for people to think about these issues. Um, so this idea, you talk a little bit about confianza. In the book, there's something more about comadrazgo, and you started your talk with this powerful photo of peers together celebrating, and but also it's this idea that you're together with other people, and maybe for the broader audience, can you explain um, the notion of comadrazgo and confianza, but also in terms of how can they help to transform academic culture?
Mhm. Well, I think in different ways, those those spaces, they're essentially their chosen family, right? I can't go to my blood family and explain that, like it's just there, but I can go to this chosen family, these other strong women, and bounce things off of them and get their insight. And we've even co-written with other Chicana Latinas, and we talk about how our experiences are so similar. Like we could trade places, and it would be like the same. And I mean, funny, not funny, but um, it that's the situation. But in order to, for my own wellness and for my own trajectory, I created those spaces for myself. And we brought more women in. And it's not just relying on one space, it's multiple spaces. And so some are virtual and some are, well, pre-COVID, they were in person and we would get together. But those support networks were really critical to, you know, get finding out about that, that hidden stuff that's happening behind the scenes that you're not privy to and that you have no idea is going on because you're a first gen everything, basically. They were so critical to my development, to finding out about resources, to finding out about how things worked. I mean, many years ago, one of those faculty in one group, she asked me to write a letter to recommend her for a leadership position. Um, I had no idea that that was a thing until she had asked me to do it, because that's just not something that I knew, right? And so just little things like that, that have been so formative to my experience just going through the tenure track process, especially for many years as the only woman in my ethnic studies department.
Thank you. Thank you for connecting with those experiences and those vignettes. It makes everything so much personable and so much we can relate to those stories. There's a question that was sent to us during the week. How can you be more proactive than reactive as faculty?
That's a good question. That requires time. Time that we don't have. If and right now time is this really weird abstract concept with a pandemic. So I'm gonna answer this question pretending that we're not in the middle of a global pandemic and that, you know, we're back to our campuses. If we weren't overburdened with the mentoring, you know, the caseload that we have, the, you know, the service commitments, then we could engage in that. We could have space for that. But we are constantly in reactive and survival mode, and it's so hard to get ahead of that. And so until you are able to make space for it, you know, you can't move forward, right? And so how do we create those spaces? How do we take stuff off of people's plates so that they can get into that mode where they're not just treading water, but they're in a position to, okay, we're going to get ahead of this before it explodes like that. I think that's where the real issue is. And unfortunately, you know, for many years that you know, in my unit is, you know, in ethnic studies, you know, we don't have a lot of resources. We're treading water all the time, just survival mode, reacting to this, reacting to that, you know, this request, this political issue. It's been challenging, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we'll be in a different space once we, you know, maybe 2 years post pandemic, where we just have to make space so that happens.
Thank you. There's another question that comes in the chat, in the Q&A, and we invite people to use those features to add questions. The question says that Dr. Gina Garcia's research talks about Hispanic serving institutions, but she pays attention on curriculum and on decolonizing the curriculum. How can scholars create processes and practices that integrate Black, Indigenous, and people of color experiences, values, and research agendas across the curriculum? Thank you for that question.
The last part, can you repeat the last part?
How can scholars create processes and practices that integrate BIPOC experiences, values, and research agendas across the curriculum?
Okay, very good. I love Dr. Garcia. I love her work. She was my mentee. It's a small, we just shared this, the small higher ed world. She was my mentee. We did the same higher ed program at UCLA. Anyway, she did phenomenal work. I think I would approach it is, I think we need to look at the course learning outcomes for the specific class. And we need to integrate as part of the course learning outcomes, whether, obviously depending on what the subject matter is, but diverse authors, diverse methods, right? Not just strictly, written papers, but how can we produce, for example, podcasts or zines to demonstrate our knowledge in the class, right? If it's not part, if we don't integrate it into the outcomes, then really you're just leaving it up to the faculty to do it however they see fit. But if you want to make it more uniform, and if you want it to be consistent, then you need to look at the course learning outcomes. And obviously that's connected to your program outcomes. So if you integrate it there, then obviously that, it'll filter into the curriculum. But that would be my suggestion for making it consistent.
Thank you. And I am connecting with my colleagues in curriculum and instruction here who are doing also amazing work in that area. So it's an unpaid announcement. But so you got a question from an old friend, Dr.
Yes.
Jennifer Delaney, and Chisme came here that you know each other from a long time, from your time at Harvard. And Dr. Delaney wants to know what's next. What's your research going? Can you talk more about what's next on your research agenda? If you will continue to produce scholarship in this space?
That's a good question. I really want to keep talking to Chicano Latina faculty. I think there's so much more there. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the presentation was a limitation of the text that it includes women that earn tenure, but it does not include women that were not granted tenure. I'd like to have that conversation with folks who fell in that, unfortunate circumstance, but it's also a very painful experience. And so I really need to reflect on that more and think about how you would approach a conversation like that. Because it's not, I in no way am trying to, exploit that experience. It's not my intention, but I really want folks to, what are the lessons learned here? What are the underlying systemic issues that causes that to happen? The other avenue I'm thinking about is centered on faculty who are at community colleges. So Chicano Latina faculty at community colleges. And I say that because that's where we find the largest proportion of Latinx students. And so talking to that group, I would love to do something connected to that. So in many ways, I think it's within a similar space, just with different populations, slightly different populations.
Thank you. And I do need to say that those testimonials and those stories in the book and in that scholarship are just so powerful, because they also validate stories that you may hear here and then, but then you can see, wait a second, there's a common theme here. But what I liked the most about the book was that it also showed the power of confianza, the power of comadresco, the power of solidarity, that opportunity to get together and to create a family, like you say, of people that we choose. And Patricia, you're in my family now.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. And thank you for seeing that. That was definitely one of the goals of the book. I think the audience was other Chicano Latina faculty who might find themselves thinking, what am I doing? Is this the right space for me? And the quick answer to that is yes. We just need to get you the support, the resources that you need. But thank you for saying that. That was one of the primary goals. So I'm glad that you connected with it. But the other piece was just sharing strategies, knowing that we're all in different institutional types, but sharing strategies. So hopefully, in every chapter, we ask them to do this, is to share, what might help future Chicano Latina faculty, who juniors or maybe aspiring faculty, so they too can be successful, however that's defined for them.
Exactly. There's times that we have our student in undergraduate courses, and then that could be the great connection. And that's also in the book, that idea that there was a story of someone who gave a speech. I don't know, because you blinded all the names, but that said, we're seeing here a next professor in the making as an undergraduate student. And that was really beautiful connection. The book is The Tenure Track Process for Chicana and Latina Faculty. Thank you so much for the privilege of being here today. And I can't wait for you to come here for champagne for real. I give you my Puerto Rican coffee and we'll be together chatting. And thank you all for your engagement and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.